Chapter 2 Sutherland and Smith. For hours that morning, and well before Daniel Cloud stood transfixed, staring in the bell tower, the air around the plaza had been troubled by a strange sound. A low rumble at first, hardly more than a whisper. It had grown in intensity to a roar until it rattled in the ears and jolted the dreams of all who heard. Those creaking wheels, cries to the oxen, that jangling of pots and pans could mean only one thing. The Mexicans of San Antonio de Bear were leaving town. Most of the men in the Texas Volunteer Army did not want to hear. They had gone to sleep late in the Mexican houses in town where they got room and board, falling into bed with the haunting rhythms of the guitar still ringing in their heads. If they thought of anything at all, it was of how the sound of castanets last night had mingled with the scrape of Davy Crockett's fiddle and the genuine Scottish drone of John McGregor's bagpipes, and of how naturally the Mexicans had danced Ch.2 while the Texans shuffled and double shuffled and cut the pigeon's wing. It was not a good morning to get up early to investigate anything. Besides, there was not much they could do. Their horses had been put out to pasture on Salado Creek, 5 miles out of town. To those who saw, the procession was both amusing and disturbing. Sorapes gave it the air of a gypsy caravan. Everyone was shouting, welcoming cousins, friends, hangers-on aboard as the wheels of the oxen carts, vast discs cut from giant cottonwood trunks, moved groaningly over the ruts in the road, bouncing the floorboards of wagons freighted down with furniture, bedclothing, stoves, and children. They might have been going to a fiesta as they headed out over the muddy road to the northwest, where the leading families owned rancherias, in addition to their homes around the plaza. What made the movement ominous was less its racket than its size. San Antonio had, of course, been full of rumors for a long time, the bad ones usually crowding out the good, and as early as a week before scattered families had begun leaving town. But this was no trickle of refugees. Today, all San Antonio seemed bent on going to the country. It was easy to see why they were leaving. If they had believed the report brought to Jim Bowie that Santa Anna had several thousand troops were on the Medina, 18 miles south. Some, those families whose members were helping the Americans, had to get away, and the others, the uncommitted ones, had an equally good reason for not remaining with their Anglo-American friends. If they joined the Texans and lost, the reprisal at Mexican hands would be beyond belief. And if they joined and won, what then? What chance would they have if the Texans were not true to their word to form a Republic of Texas and join the United States instead? There were signs of it already. Had not Travis and the War Party been getting guns and ammunition from the States for a long time? Were not most of the men at the Alamo from the States? And was it not the fear of shutting off this flow of volunteers that had sparked the present trouble? The signs were unmistakable. This Sam Houston, for example, this strange man who sometimes wore Indian clothes and went on retreats among the Indians when he felt sick at heart, what was he doing in Texas anyway? He had come 4 years ago for a visit. He remained a commander-in-chief. He had come as a friend of President Andrew Jackson, and he remained, perhaps, as Jackson's spy. No, they would not be taken in that way, not when there were Texans saying the land rightfully belonged to the States, had belonged to them ever since the Louisiana Purchase. Better to play it safe and go to the country, their own country, where they had farms to tend. The surprising thing was that Annie remained. On Soledad Street, within sight of the San Fernando Bell Tower, the Esparza boys and their little sister still played, darting in and out of the buildings and filling the streets with their laughter. It had seemed strange to Daniel Cloud that they were still here, when Gregorio Esparza was known to have joined the Texan cause. But even more surprising, to the Mexicans leaving town at least, was not why San Antonians were leaving, but why Texans were staying. Were they complete fools to remain standing in the path of what could only cut them down? Where was there to hide in San Antonio, and what was there to protect now that they had all their possessions with them? Why were the Anglos here at all, in a land that meant nothing to them, a land that was not even their own? They were surely greater idiots than even the Mexicans supposed if they remained now when all common sense said to flee. Such were the questions in the Mexican mind, but before they could be answered, a new sound had torn across the quiet city, the bell of San Fernando, used only for the Angelus and Mass, and the most solemn of occasions, pealing urgently now as they had never heard it at this time of day. Ambrosio Rodriguez, on the road to the north, where he had just said goodbye to his family, heard the sound and looked up with alarm. He had told the Americans, he thought, told them time and time again, And each time Travis said the same thing, I know, but I would rather die here than abandon this town, which is the key to Texas. He had been, Ambrosio Rodriguez reflected as he stared in the direction of the sound, like talking to a stone wall. William Barrett Travis was the first man up the narrow steps of the bell tower, followed closely by Dr. John Sutherland, one of the post's 6 doctors. On the platform they found Cloud wildly pulling the bell rope. Travis covered his ears. An enemy within 20 miles would be alerting now. As Sutherland surveyed the countryside, Travis questioned the sentry, who could hardly speak for excitement. The Mexicans had come back, he said, thousands of them. Where? Dr. Sutherland asked. As more Texans swarmed on the platform, Daniel Cloud pointed, to his surprise, to emptiness. Where only a moment before he had seen hundreds, perhaps thousands of Mexican soldiers performing maneuvers on horseback, seeing lances and pennons and glistening helmets. Now there was nothing but flat, bare landscape. The semi-desert land shone white in the early morning sun. Disbelief was the easiest reaction after fear. The sentry, the men decided, had seen a mirage. Perhaps he was still drunk from last night's fandango. Cloud could only stammer out a protest. He had seen them. He had even seen their lances gleaming in the sun. One of the men laughed. The greenhorn sentry had better go back to sleep, grumbling about youngsters still wet behind the ears. The men scrambled back downstairs. Travis and Sutherland stayed behind. Travis wanted to believe his men. He always had, trusting them more than some of them knew. But this time he could not. It was not that the sentry was lying, for the look on his face showed unmistakably that he had seen something, or thought he had. But seen what? An advance patrol that the bell had frightened away? Or had he only, like the Mexicans leaving San Antonio that morning, been panicked into seeing something that was not there? Walking around the bell tower, Travis studied the barren, winter-stricken land that stretched in all directions as far as the eye could see. Santa Anna, he told himself again, would have had to cross 300 miles of that land, and cross it in February weather. His horses would not have had enough to eat, and whatever Jim Bowie might say about dry mesquite grass, the fact remained that much of that grass had been burned in the last campaign by Texas scouts. It was only 2 months since then, 2 months since the last Mexican soldier in Texas had crossed the Rio Grande in defeat. It was not a thought to be taken lightly. Those 4 straight Texas victories at Gonzales, at Goliad, at Concepcion, particularly at Bexar, where General Coss had been utterly routed after 4 furious days of fighting that had cost the Texans the life of Ben Milam. Coss had given up the fort he had improvised out of the near ruins of the Alamo, and surrendering to superior Texan marksmanship, had left, promising never to return. It was no small thing that the Texans, without so much as a declaration of war or independence, had driven south of the Rio Grande the last remnants of any Mexican army ever in Texas. Most of the Texans had thought the war for independence was over, thought they were free men. But if the defeat of General Coss was not to be taken lightly, neither was the Matamoros venture that now left the Alamo weaker than the Texans stationed there liked to admit. From the first there had been those, Dr. James Grant and Colonel F.W. Johnson among others, who had wished to follow up the victory and carry the war into Mexico. Matamoros, the Mexican port south of the Rio Grande, which would have been crucial in any future invasion of Texas, had been the target chosen. And Matamoros fever, with its promise of the loot and adventure, was the new ailment that had swept like wildfire through the troops. It would have been a difficult time for the Texas Volunteer Army in any case. The larger part of the men who had fought against General Coss in the campaign of 1835 were backwoods farmers who had signed up for only 2 months at a relatively convenient time between harvest and spring planting. By December, most of them had been needed back at their farms. To their astonishment, Travis and the other volunteers from the state suddenly found themselves the largest component of the Texas Army. For 200 of these men, then to set off from the Alamo in search of more troops to fight could only mean a weakening of the gravest sort. The fever which had already split the provisional government into 2 governments now split the army, and for the same reason, the thought of glory. Travis might have been a part of it himself if he had not felt it his responsibility to hold this position. Certainly there was no glory in being co-commander of a fort that was largely a crumbling ruin. It was stronger now, of course. Jim Bowie and Major Green B. Jameson had seen to that, but Travis could have used those 200 men. Ironically, they had not got to Matamoros at all, but were stalled at Goliad 85 miles south, east on the San Antonio River, waiting for Colonel James W. Fannin to make up his West Point mind about whether to carry the war to the halls of Montezuma. The statistics were not good. Fannin had almost 500 men. Travis had 150. It would take 1,000 to defend the Alamo. There was no need for alarm, Travis told himself. Fannin might be on his way this very minute. Still, he wished Goliad were not several days' march away. Frowning, he looked up to see Dr. Sutherland standing before him, waiting for an answer to a question Travis had not heard. Private Cloud, Sutherland said, still swore he had seen Mexican troops. Travis studied the older man's face. Sutherland was an able doctor who had healed most of the men wounded in the campaign against General Cost, and a successful businessman as well. His face showed mingled resolution and doubt. Turning, Travis yelled to Private Cloud to remain at his post, and next time to see straight, but he hurried down the stairs to call for volunteers. The men assembled in the plaza below the bell tower of San Fernando were not accustomed to orders. Discipline was not the strong point of this army of volunteers that seldom got its pay, where every man was his own general, as well as his own quartermaster and commissary. The sharp tone of Travis's request, asking for volunteers to ride out and look over the hill, broke rudely into their thoughts. They had considered the whole thing a joke, a stupid greenhorn's mirage, and not a good joke at that, shaking them from their beds and the one morning they wanted to sleep. Some of them, pursuing their pleasure, had gone to bed only a few hours before. The Travis who stood before them now, however, left no doubts as to his seriousness. His eyes flashed with a new authority, one they had not seen before, and after the initial doubts, a tremor of excitement went through the ranks. Maybe there would be some action after all. Maybe someone had finally assumed command around here. His request, however, was clearly impossible. Even if they had felt up to walking the 5 miles to Salado Creek to get their horses, there was no time for doing so. Someone with a horse would have to go. Their eyes swung to Dr. Sutherland and John W. Smith. John Sutherland had been in Texas only 3 months now, and in San Antonio only 30 days. He had come here for the climate, not to fight. He was not an army man at all, just as he was not originally a doctor, but an Alabama planter whose hobby of medicine had become a full-time pursuit. And it was not freedom, but the dry, healthy air of San Antonio that caused him to come out here, following an older brother. Even now his family was waiting in Alabama, ready to follow as soon as he gave the word. A glance at the assembled faces put an end to his thoughts. These were not all army men either. Many of the younger ones had never fired a gun before except to hunt squirrels. Silently he mounted, grateful for a horse he could rely upon. Travis repeated his orders, and Sutherland made a request of his own. Would Travis remind the sentry in the tower to pull the bell rope for dear life if he saw them riding back at full speed? Travis nodded, and with Smith at his side, Dr. Sutherland wheeled his horse and rode away. The men in the plaza watched them go in silence. The sun was higher now, and they were beginning to feel their fatigue. They wished Travis would dismiss them, despite his new authority. Few of them really believed that old Santiani had his yellow bellies and had crossed the desert in the wintertime, and shortly they ceased to worry about it. There were better things to fill your minds with, better things such as munificent land bounties Texas was going to give them as soon as it won its independence. Sutherland and Smith were good riders, and Smith had already proved himself a superb scout. When the previous December he had been able to supply the Texans an invaluable map of San Antonio for their successful attack. A large part of the victory at that time had been due to his superb engineering skill. Unlike the newcomer Sutherland, John W. Smith had been in Texas 10 years, coming there from Virginia by the way of Missouri in 1826. And unlike Sutherland, with his doctor's sense of detachment, John Smith felt involved with the land in a peculiar way. He had been a married man when he came here to collect a $4,000 debt. Succumbing to the spell of the countryside, he had written his wife in Missouri to follow him. Her brothers, though, were full of stories of Indians that delighted the 2 Smith children but froze the blood of their mother. Instead of coming, she sent word that she was getting a divorce. It was a heavy blow for a young landowner with a resounding character endorsement from the 12 leading citizens of Hannibal in his pocket, but the young Smith liked the little town of Bayard too much to turn back. The town liked him too. His red hair got him a nickname, El Colorado. His good sense got him riches. In time he met and fell in love with Maria Jesus de Curbelo, a descendant of one of the Canary Island families Philip V had sent over to help found New Spain, and in time he married her. Joining the Catholic Church, he was baptized in San Fernando and was soon making a home for himself. Already he had been welcomed into it another young settler, Sam Maverick. He had become one of the 3 richest men in town. It was Maria he was thinking of now as he rode over the muddy road beside Sutherland. Like other Texan leaders who had married Mexican girls, Jim Bowie, Captain William Cook, Deaf Smith, Philip Dimmitt, and others, he knew the conflict as a personal one, knowing full well the struggle in his wife's mind, forced to choose between her countrymen and her Anglo-American husband, and the pride in his own when he had learned of her decision. At this very moment she was waiting on Soledad Street for the wagon he had ordered to remove her and her friends, the Esparza family, to safety. As they rode now over the hilly trail to the west, Smith looked back with a feeling of warmth toward the town that had welcomed him and given him a home. Like an oasis, it lay in the arms of the milky green San Antonio River, flowing clear and 60 feet wide from its head spring only a few miles to the north. The town looked peaceful and clean, with its rows of adobe houses along Soledad, itself a reminder of the peaceful days when Solitary Street had been the only street in town. Now there were a number of streets in the city of 4,000 people, and yet, for all the skill Don Antonio Menchaca had shown in straightening trails so that the low, flat-roofed houses would face onto the 2 open plazas and the semblance of a military fort, it was hard to think of it as a place of war, a place to be defended. It had stood against the Comanches and the Lipans, but it could hardly stand against Santa Anna, nor did the 5 crumbling missions scattered along the river offer much defense. The Spaniards had usually established equally strong presidios or forts to accompany their missions, but in the case of the Alamo and the 4 others near San Antonio abandoned years ago, they had for some reason failed to do so. The mission stood useless and moldering, evidence of a once powerful missionary zeal and a reminder of other, more peaceful days. Exchanging a silent glance, the 2 scouts rode cautiously on. The sudden shower during the night had made the road slippery and deepened its mud holes. The ruts were a snare. Looking back at San Fernando Tower, the 2 men had a feeling of urgent eyes upon them as they sped their horses over the wet road. The temperature was at a pleasant 60 degrees, and the time was nearing noon. Waiting for news that would put their gnawing doubts to rest, the Texans in the plaza had focused upon the passing caravan as a means of killing time. It disturbed them to see their companions of last night, who only a few hours ago had been grinning and comparing Davy Crockett's fiddle and bagpipe contest with the sound of cats in a beehive driving their ox carts solemnly by. To all Texan queries, the Mexicans replied with evasion. "Senor, it is time to tend the fields. In winter? Senor, it is spring. Look, already the willows are out." As if in proof, some flicked their mules with branches bearing the first spring leaves. Travis, running his fingers through his thatch of fiery red hair, was also thinking of the early spring. He had been so sure Santa Anna could not arrive before March 15th, but then he had been sure of many things. He remembered with chagrin how he had insisted at the defeat of General Cos 2 months before that no Mexican army would ever invade Texas again. It was frightening, the tricks time played. If only Bonham would arrive, he kept thinking. Jim Bonham, the courier he had sent to Colonel Fannin 6 days before. Bonham was a distant cousin, an old friend of Travis's, since they had gone to school together in Red Bank, South Carolina. If any man could talk Fannin into coming, the eloquent Bonham could. What was needed now was time to think. Calling Davy Crockett, he placed him in command of the plaza until he formulated his plans. The one he dreaded to see was Bowie. He had not forgotten the parade Bowie had staged as a rebuke to him only 9 days before, the parade that said Bowie too is in command here. He would be waiting now with a comment about understanding the Mexican mind, feeling superior for having adopted their ways. Travis, on the other hand, had adopted no one's ways. He was proud of being different even from his own men, among whom he alone wore a regular uniform. He had adopted Mexican ways, taking over that mentality bred. If he had adopted Mexican ways, taking over that mentality bred for centuries on regimentation, he would have left San Antonio long ago. To leave, it is common sense, Ambrosio Rodriguez had said, but this was not a common sense war, as Travis was not a common sense man. Nothing about the Texans made common sense. Travis was proud of belonging to a people who had known no moderation from the time they fought the Revolution against England to the day they followed Stephen F. Austin into the wilderness. While Davy Crockett and the other Alamo men watched the exodus of townsfolk and shook their heads, William B. Travis set about asking himself how to defend an entire city when you had not enough troops even to man its mission fort. Sutherland and Smith were about a mile and a half out of town when they saw the Mexican cavalry. Reined in at the crest of the highest western hill, they could only sit in silence, the blood draining from their faces, and stare as Private Daniel Cloud had stared earlier that morning. Below them, in a clearing between Chaparral and Mesquite Thicket, were 1,500 Mexican cavalry troops performing maneuvers in the morning sun. Again, it was the glint of sunlight on the polished lances that held the scouts motionless. They had never seen anything like it. The lances dipping and flashing among the flutter of pennons, the light gleaming on hundreds of sabers. The scouts tried not to look at one another. It took only a moment to calculate that here on horseback alone was a force 10 times that now waiting in the plaza. Nor had they ever seen such uniforms. The dragoons in their red short coats and vivid blue trousers, their high black helmets decorated with horsehair or bearskin, the men armed with lances and pennons, with sabers, with carbines, holster pistols. But if the cavalry looked elegant, their commander, riding up and down in front of his men, looked most elegant of all. In golden epaulets, and red frogging, a high-peaked broad sombrero hiding his face, he waved his sword as he rode. Stately in his indigo blue jacket, his slashed trousers disappearing into the silver guards of his stirrups, General Ramirez y Sesma was surely as forbidding as Santa Anna himself would have been. Instinctively, and in spite of himself, Dr. Sutherland glanced at the buckskin hunting shirts and trousers his companion wore. The gestures reminded him of their position. Perhaps they had been seen. At this very moment, the Mexican general might be ordering the attack. With a glance at John W. Smith and a hasty exchange of words, Dr. Sutherland wheeled his mount. Spurring their horses violently, they raced away in the direction of the plaza. As they fled downhill, John Smith's thoughts were of his wife, waiting now for the wagon he had arranged to send. For the first time, the sense of immediate danger struck home. The cry behind him brought him to a halt on the slippery hill. When he turned, he saw that Sutherland was down, struggling beneath his horse. Smoothshod, Dr. Sutherland's horse, had been having trouble all morning. Now spurred to a gallop in the mud from last night's rain, it had stumbled 50 yards below the crest of the hill and come to a stiff-legged halt that threw the doctor to the ground and pitched his gun from his hand. The horse, sliding, had fallen directly across the rider's knees. Sutherland said not a word as Smith knelt beside him. He tried not to alarm Smith. Their message was all important. When he reached for the gun after Smith had brought both horse and rider to the feet, he found it broken off at the breech. Back on his horse, Sutherland knew he was badly lamed, but his pain must not delay the message. He told his companion to gallop ahead while there was still time. Once within sight of San Antonio, Sutherland looked back. If Santa Anna had seen them, he had not yet given chase. The bell of the tower of San Fernando Church was now ringing violently, spreading the news in all directions that the two riders were returning at full speed. Daniel Cloud, with all the fury of a man whose word had been questioned, was pulling the rope triumphantly, giving the alarm to Travis, to the Mexicans leaving town, to Santa Anna himself. The latter peals told the breathless riders they were nearing home. Then, as they entered the town, the bell stopped ringing. The plaza was deserted, white and empty in the midday sun. The houses were silent shells. On their sweating horses, Smith and Sutherland could not have known that at the first tolling peals from the bell tower, Travis had given the order the men were waiting for, the order to withdraw into the Alamo.